We're just going to wait for our numbers to increase slightly. So if you just give us a few minutes and we'll wait while the numbers are ticking up nicely at the moment, but we'll give it a few more minutes. Okay, so numbers are still ticking up slightly, but at a slower rate. So we'll probably make a start, seeing as it's a couple of minutes past. So thank you, everyone, for joining us on this webinar this afternoon. This is presented to you by the Longevity and Mortality Actuaries Forum. And today I'm really pleased to welcome Ashley Campbell, who is going to talk to us about dementia and Alzheimer's disease and how to model for it. So, Ashley is a consultant in the areas of longevity, mortality, and infectious disease risk modelling. And he has worked with some of the largest insurers, reinsurers, and pension consultants in the market. His area of expertise is devising innovative, multidisciplinary solutions to clients' risk modelling problems and leveraging his experience across actuarial modelling, cause of death, and risk factors based mortality and longevity modelling, and also catastrophe risk modelling. So Ashley's got a bachelor's degree in actuarial science and maths from the University of Manchester and is a fellow of the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries and also a chartered enterprise risk actuary. Ashley regularly presents at IFoA conferences and also sits on the IFoA's Mortality Research Steering Committee. And just to introduce myself, of course, so my name's Caroline Roberts. I'm a longevity risk actuary at the Phoenix Group, and so I'm on the committee of the Longevity Mortality Actuaries Forum, which is a member interest group covering the areas of longevity and mortality. And I also sit on the committee as well for the MRSC. Okay, so Ashley's planning on talking probably for around about 50-ish minutes today. And really, you'll see there's a chat function at the bottom there. Please ask any questions as you think of them. Sometimes if you leave it towards to the end, you may forget. So as any questions come up, please add them into the chat and we'll ask them rather than interrupt Ashley on the way as he goes. And we will ask them all at the end when we will have our Q&A session. So without any further ado, I'd like to pass over to Ashley. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. So this is a presentation that we give at the LIFE conference last year, myself and my colleague Chris Martin. So hopefully everyone finds it interesting, and apologies to anyone that was there that's already seen this. But yeah, so the focus is on dementia, but more specifically on Alzheimer's. And just by a little bit of background on myself, so I'm a director at Crystallise, and we are a biomedical research and modelling consultancy with a specific focus on taking a multidisciplinary approach to modelling within the insurance space, but also within the pharmaceutical space as well. And this presentation, the focus is mainly to demonstrate the uncertainty that exists with estimating the true burden of disease associated with dementia as a broad disease, and also how this differs by age and socioeconomic group. And then we'll delve into the biomedical side, so recent drug approvals and what they mean for longevity, and tie that all together with the burden of disease. And we'll begin with a little bit of background on dementia itself. So dementia is a progressive disease or condition, and it differs by individual how fast it progresses, but generally it begins with memory loss, mood changes, and progresses towards reduced thinking speed, movement problems, and difficulties performing everyday tasks. Now, not all dementia is Alzheimer's, and this is quite important. In fact, dementia could be thought of as a byproduct of Alzheimer's, if you like, and around 50% of dementias are considered to be, or just over 50% are considered to be as a result of Alzheimer's. And Alzheimer's is generally thought of as being a buildup of a protein called amyloid plaques between brain cells and another protein called tau, which occurs within the brain cells themselves. There are other forms of dementia as well that are quite material in terms of mortality. One being vascular dementia. This is essentially a series of strokes which over time cause damage to the brain, and depending on where the damage occurs, the actual outcome for the individual or the progression can differ. Another important form to be aware of is Lewy body disease. This is similar to dementia in terms of its presentation, but there is a greater emphasis on confusion and movement disorders, quite similar actually to Parkinson's itself. So how do we interpret all this information? For the purposes of this presentation, we're focused on Alzheimer's disease, and as we can see, Alzheimer's disease accounts for around half of dementias, and therefore therapies targeting Alzheimer's disease will only really benefit about half of dementia cases overall. Another observation, the observed population prevalence of dementia has risen over the past 2 decades up until the pandemic. This can be observed in various population data sources. One being the quality and outcomes framework, which is essentially when GPs report on the prevalence of dementia. And we can see here a sort of short period of data from 2011 onwards that shows the prevalence rate of dementia increasing over time, plateauing, flattening out, and in the period of the pandemic, we've seen a slight drop in the prevalence rate. Now, these rates are not age standardized, so we can see in the early period that increase can generally be attributed to an aging population, if you like. And in the sort of latter period, the pandemic period, these effects are a combination of frailty effects, so individuals essentially dying off due to direct effects of the pandemic, and potentially also reductions in the diagnosis of dementia incidence. If we look at mortality data and specifically age standardize it to remove the effects of the aging population, we can look further back as well. We get a better picture for how dementia has changed over time, and we can actually pinpoint what has driven that kind of temporal change. So in and around 2003, there was actually a financial incentive for GPs to diagnose dementia. Prior to this, there was no real incentive, mainly because there wasn't much doctors could do about it. So there was no real incentive to actually officially diagnose it. This resulted in around 2006 an uptick as it flowed through to mortality in dementia deaths. And then around 2010 or so, there was a change in coding practices, and the combination of this and the incentivization of GPs to both report and diagnose dementia and also put dementia on people's death certificates, resulted in quite a significant uptick from 2010 right up to present day. There was another coding change as well in and around 2014, which resulted in some uptick. This was generally the earlier coding change was recoding of vascular issues to dementia, and the latter being issues around issues with the lungs being attributed to dementia as well. The pandemic saw a downtick in mortality overall, and generally this can be attributed to the frailty effects, this idea that individuals with dementia ended up dying of COVID instead, earlier than expected. So how can we interpret this information for the purposes of our presentation or our research? And well, there may be some increase in the prevalence of and deaths from dementia as a result of the decline in competing causes, and we see this towards the latter part of the data. However, the change in prevalence is largely reflecting the incentivized diagnosis and change in coding. So I think the overall sort of outcome from this information is, yes, there's an increase in the data, but it is not representative necessarily of a change in the risk of dementia itself. Okay, so let's move on to looking at stratifying the data. So we want to understand what is the prevalence of dementia amongst different age groups and socioeconomic groups. And we'll first start with the age groups. So this is looking at the age-specific mortality rate within England in 2019. And we see this sort of Gompertz-style increase with age. And this is important because it sort of shows that as the population ages, there will be an increase in the overall number of deaths, increase in the overall total prevalence associated with dementia, and of course, therefore a larger burden being placed on the healthcare system. If we look at the socioeconomic differences, and for this we've used the incidence rate for dementia, and we've used wealth as our indicator of socioeconomic status. And from left to right, we have the wealthier quintile of the population, and on the right hand side we have the least wealthy, and we see this sort of stark increase in incidence rates from around 0.8 right up to 1.4% for the lowest wealth quintile. Now, interestingly, this is not age standardized, and if we were to age standardize this, actually the picture would become even starker, because of course the wealthier individuals tend to be older on average relative to the least wealthy populations. So again, how do we interpret this information? Well, we sort of know fairly clearly from the age profile that as the population ages, so too will the prevalence rate or the total prevalence will increase. And there is, in fact, a genuine correlation or negative correlation between wealth and dementia incidence. So the wealthier you are, the less likely you are to have dementia. Okay, so we're going to do a poll, or take a poll, and this is relevant to the next few slides, where we're going to look at specifically cohort studies to get a better understanding of the true prevalence, the true incidence within England of dementia itself. So if everyone can sort of put their answers down for what they think the results of those cohort studies will show us. So if we age standardize, so if we remove the age effect, what is the dementia incidence and prevalence rate expected to do in England? Is it A, fall, B, increase, or C, remain broadly flat? Okay, so it seems to be a fairly hefty weight on increase. So if we move on to our next slide, people will probably be surprised to learn, therefore, that actually, if we remove recording biases that exist in the data, and we can do this through longitudinal studies, we actually expect the prevalence and the incidence to fall, and obviously removing the age effect as well. Now, that's not to say that we expect dementia in totality to decrease. That's not the case. And actually, if we look at a projection of dementia prevalence over time, we see actually the total number of individuals with dementia is going to increase, and that poses a big problem for the healthcare system. And actually, due to the aging population, the number of severe, or the total proportion of severe cases, is also going to increase as well, causing additional strain on the healthcare system. But by looking at cohort studies, we can better understand what is actually happening to prevalence rates and incidence rates. And if we begin by looking at the ALSA study, so this is a longitudinal study of aging in the English population, so around 20,000 participants aged 50 and above from outset, and generally their aging has been observed over the last 20 years. What people are diagnosed with over time is recorded, deaths are recorded, and so on and so forth. And we're able to get a more true representation of population incidence and prevalence associated with dementia. And when we age standardize the incidence rates within the study, we see that actually they are decreasing at quite a significant rate, around 2.7%, and we see that incidence rates are higher for women, slightly higher for women relative to male, which is consistent with the general population data. And I always like to think about incidence and prevalence within the concept of, or this concept of, the epidemiologist bathtub, where we have incidence increasing the water level. So this is essentially new cases coming in, and deaths decreasing the water level, and the overall water level with time being the total prevalence of a particular disease. Of course, we have recoveries for other diseases, but unfortunately for dementia, that's not the case. So if we look at the prevalence data for this particular longitudinal study, and in the top graph, we see prevalence over time without age standardization. So this is total prevalence, and we see for men it's increasing and expected to increase and potentially plateau over time. And for women, we're actually seeing an earlier plateau moving towards a decrease. If we age standardize, actually we see that decreasing prevalence in both men and women. We can triangulate this study with other aging studies as well. So the CFAS1 and the CFAS2 recruitment occurred at different time periods, sort of late 80s for the first study, and sort of 2008, 2011 for the second study. And we can see that the age-specific prevalence, when both studies are compared, has in fact decreased. So this is a sort of a way of corroborating that previous study that we just looked at. So how do we interpret this information? So that decreasing trend in prevalence that we see in the cohort studies is actually a representation or a product of risk factors coming down within the underlying population, and improvements in, or reductions in smoking, improvements in blood pressure, and so on, which has an effect on the incidence. But despite all of this, of course, we expect the total prevalence to increase due to the aging population. So another observation, the prevalence of routinely diagnosed dementia is lower than the expected prevalence from longitudinal studies. So the benefit of these longitudinal studies is that we can get an understanding to what degree dementia is underrepresented within general population data, or underdiagnosed, if you like. And actually we can use the QOTs, so that framework by which GPs report prevalence of dementia, and compare that to longitudinal studies to get an understanding of how general population dementia diagnosis rates compare to these longitudinal studies. And The rate is around 68%. That is around 2/3 of dementia within the general population goes diagnosed, or if you like, a third goes undiagnosed. And we see over time, actually, during the pandemic, diagnosis rates fell by around a nominal amount of about 6%. And that's just as a result of strain on the healthcare system. The predictors of undiagnosed dementia are a number of factors: cardiovascular disease, comorbidities, people generally living alone and going undiagnosed, people much older, less likely to get diagnosed, less likely sometimes to get diagnosed of dementia, and also at the very early stages, people just not getting diagnosed as a result of the mildness of how it presents. So how can we interpret the data? Well, in dementia is generally underdiagnosed within England and Wales. An important aspect to understand when trying to estimate the potential effect size of a treatment. Of course, if you're not diagnosed, you're not going to get treated. And we only identify about 2/3 of cases. However, this also shows that there's scope to expand the potential target of particular of treatment to get a better through getting better diagnosis. Okay, so on to the treatment side of this presentation. So there are now treatments that reduce the rate of progress of dementia, and specifically Alzheimer's disease. And this is only in the last sort of year and a half. So December 2022, the first treatment came out, approved by the FDA, and there have been 1 or 2 treatments approved since then. So in order to understand how these treatments are having an impact on the progression of dementia for Alzheimer's disease, I'll quickly give a very simple illustration of what these or of what Alzheimer's disease actually does to the brain. So this is a synapse in the brain, and a join in the middle. We have a join between 2 nerves, and the nerve to the left receives a signal, and that signal arrives at the end of the nerve and sends these little chemicals called neurotransmitter packets to the receiving nerve, and then this end transfers information to the whatever function it's trying to carry out. Now, there we go. Within Alzheimer's disease, these amyloid plaque proteins build up between nerve cells and can cause damage over time. But actually, there's a lot of people that have this that actually have no symptoms whatsoever because they aren't causing any damage yet to the nerves themselves. And sometimes the presentation is so mild, there's no sort of reason to go to the doctor. Oh, geez, I don't know why this is. There we go. There we go. We also have these tau proteins that build up within the nerve as a result of Alzheimer's, and over time these progress. There we go. Into a more severe form of Alzheimer's disease. So here we see, quite simply, these amyloid plaques taking over the brain cell and disrupting the functionality, and also causing damage to the architecture of the brain. So what treatments do we have for Alzheimer's currently? There are a number of treatments, and generally they are thought of as being stimulants, helping individuals be more alert, pay attention better, mostly just symptom relief, not really slowing any progression or improving the outcome for individuals. They make small differences to cognitive performance scores, but generally differences can be seen at a population level. There wouldn't be much seen for a particular individual. But now we have a number of treatments for Alzheimer's disease. So the first was aducanumab, followed by lecanemab, 2 treatments, or MABs, if you like, which are monoclonal antibodies. So these were recently approved by the FDA. Now, there was some controversy around aducanumab. Not going to get into it in detail here, but essentially they finished the final trial early, and the results seemed to be inconclusive. But when they dug deeper, they found actually that the effect was more important than any negative outcomes that might have been found that caused the trial to end. The FDA controversially approved the drug, but it hasn't and is not expected to make its way to Europe or the UK. Lecanemab, though, has had positive results approved by the FDA and is currently going through what's called a HTA submission for use within the UK. So NICE are currently deciding whether to use that, and that's basically a decision based off of the value that comes from the cost of the actual drug itself. And we expect to see something early this year, whether or not it actually gets used within the NHS. And these drugs target these amyloid plaques through these monoclonal antibodies and result in a slowdown in the progression of mild Alzheimer's disease. And that's really important. This drug has only been approved for an indication of mild Alzheimer's disease. So it hasn't been tested on individuals with more progressive Alzheimer's disease or a more severe Alzheimer's disease. And the slowdown is considered to be around 30% or so in terms of the progression of mild Alzheimer's disease. Now, if we go back to our very simple diagram, we have our built-up amyloid plaques in this individual that has mild, perhaps Alzheimer's disease, and they're able to take the monoclonal antibodies, which attach themselves to the amyloid plaques and essentially trigger an immune response that allows white cells to come and essentially consume these amyloid plaques. As a result, the amyloid plaques disappear. For lecanemab, this takes around 18 months, so a very long time, especially for an individual with Alzheimer's disease. But as you can see here in this very simple demonstration, the architectural damage remains. So the amyloid plaques are removed, but actually any damage that has already occurred stays there. There's no repair that occurs as a result of this intervention. So how do we interpret this? Oh, and also to point out the size of the damage for an individual with a more severe form of Alzheimer's would of course remain as well. So how to interpret this? Well, there are new treatments, of course, yes, that's great, but it's only for mild dementia, so this reduces our target population size, and they do not reverse the damage already caused. We do not yet know the mortality impact of this particular treatment, but we can model it. The studies don't last long enough to understand the mortality outcome, and they actually use biomarkers and progression tests to understand the effect on Alzheimer's disease itself. So on to our next poll. So on the next few slides, we're going to look at the pipeline for dementia, and this is a poll just to see how many interventions people think are actually in the pipeline right now. well, as of September 2023, when we actually pulled the data. So is it 48, 123, 210, or 478? Okay, so it seems to be neck and neck between B and C, which is great. Oh, and it looks like B's taking it, just about. So actually the answer is 210 as of September 2023, which is actually quite a lot, and we'll go into details around those particular drugs in a moment. This information is taken from a proprietary data set that we have, which essentially accumulates information from a number of different data sources, such as clinicaltrials.gov, and gets augmented in order to allow us to aggregate the different treatment types. And here we can see a visualization of the pipeline in broad categories. Of course, the types of interventions vary quite significantly, but they can be grouped into broad categories. And a large proportion of these are drugs, and within that, quite a significant proportion are actually symptom relief focused, so unlikely to have a significant impact on mortality. There are a number of drugs, of course, that are treatments. One which is really interesting is a drug called AD04, which was actually came about quite serendipitously, whereby there was a trial some time ago looked at the effects of a particular vaccine and the control used, and the AD04 is essentially used to try and improve the efficacy of vaccines. So within the control group or the placebo group, AD04 was given, and we saw actually an improvement in dementia outcomes for that placebo group. And now there are trials ongoing for AD04 as an intervention for dementia. I'm not going to talk about each and every one here. Monoclonal antibodies is, of course, the group that lecanemab falls into, but there's also they sort of vary in their how they actually affect the individual. One to actually note as being the most promising in terms of its effect on mortality would be stem cell therapies. So stem cell therapies generally quell inflammation, stimulate repair within the body, but we're a long way off. There is one drug called Lomecel-B, which actually in January released or announced a successful phase 2 trial, which actually showed slowing of the progression of the disease. But quite importantly, if we think back to what lecanemab does, this drug actually stimulates repair. So we can imagine it being quite an important drug to follow in this area. Vaccines sort of work in a similar way to monoclonal antibodies. Tyrosine kinase inhibitors work a little bit differently. Generally, they kind of enhance this. This is called phagocytosis, essentially where the white cells engulf the amyloid plaques. So tyrosine kinase inhibitors work in a similar way to this, but they sort of make the efficacy of that better. So you can imagine it being combined with monoclonal antibodies to provide a better treatment, and stem cell therapy potentially being used in combination to improve this issue around repair. If we look quickly at the pipeline, we can see here actually most of the drugs in the pipeline right now are in phase 3 and phase 2, which is great news for the short term, because the probability of success in these phases are actually quite high. Phase 3 has around a 70-80% success probability. Phase 1 actually really low, and phase 2 lower than phase 3. Just as a bit of background information, phase 1 trials are generally just to test efficacy and toxicity of a particular drug, and there are only a small number of individuals, handful. Phase 2 trials increase the number of individuals, but they're more looking to determine the most optimum dosage. And then phase 3 includes a larger group of individuals and trying to get a more accurate idea, like a statistically more accurate idea of what the effect size is, and any possible harms as well, which you find out more of when you get a larger population. Generally speaking, probability of success overall from phase 1 right through to phase 3 is about 10%, and you can expect from phase 1 down to approval can take upwards of 15 years or so. So you can sort of get a feel for what the pipeline looks like, and actually phase 1, phase 2 looks a little bit light for dementia, whereas so we might see a slowdown in the longer term for these particular phases as well. So how do we interpret all this information? There is a substantial amount of research going on, and with the number of trials, 210 it was, we'd expect some success there, statistically speaking. So we should expect a sort of a flow of interventions over the next few years, and perhaps similar to HIV as well. It's not a particular intervention per se that is the breakthrough, but actually it's a combination of all of these different interventions that are getting pushed through the pipeline. So it might be a cocktail actually that has the breakthrough. And of course, there's as we saw on the last slide, a significant proportion that are in phase 3 trials. So we've talked a little bit about the interventions themselves, lecanemab in particular, and its effect on the body, on the biology. And we want to now try and understand how it affects life expectancy or mortality. Whenever these drugs go through the approval process for a particular regulator, so in the UK, the regulator is NICE, and the approval process is a health technology assessment. They generally are assessing the cost benefit of a particular drug. This is essentially calculating the number of good lives or good years gained essentially from the drug and relative to the cost of the drug. Now, to give a sort of indication of the scale, lecanemab is around $50,000-$60,000 for treatment. So fairly expensive, but not out there. But if the efficacy or the impact of the drug is not enough to condone the NHS purchasing or paying for it, then they won't approve it. But it is approved in the US for use. But anyway, these health technology assessments use Markov models to quantify the cost benefit associated with these drugs. So imagine instead of being interested in mortality, they're interested in the actual the good years gained from this particular intervention, and the cost, using the cost associated with it to determine the cost of those good years gained. So Markov model is great because we can essentially build structural representation of how the disease progresses, and through this we can set transition rates for the progression. And if we know the slowdown in the rate of transition or the rate of progression, and we know the mortality for each state, we can then quantify the potential mortality impact as a result of the intervention, and then corroborate that against the health technology assessments that get carried out. So this is a Markov model, very simple. I'm sure a lot of actuaries are going to be familiar with Markov models. Just as a sort of quick introduction, so from left to right, we have mild cognitive impairment and mild Alzheimer's disease. These are the two states that we can intervene on for a particular individual, because lecanemab is only targeting or only indicated for mild Alzheimer's disease. Individuals transition as the disease progresses into moderate states, severe, and they can transition into the death state at different rates, of course, depending on the for each state. And in order to gather the data, we conducted a target literature review, and we needed to get so the way in which these models are generally parameterized is by getting estimates for the transition probabilities, and that is just, you know, what are the rates of transition during currently, so supportive care rates of transition, and then we get the hazard ratios, so the effect of these states on mortality itself, and then we try and get an understanding as well of what proportions of individuals sit within each state. And from all this information, we can get a kind of view of the world of how an individual, a group of individuals transition from state to state over time, and as a result, make their way into the dead state, and therefore we can get estimates for the impact on mortality. And for this particular exercise, we just focused on age 65, individual age 65, males, females, and we sort of used the HTA assessments as our sort of validation of the outputs themselves. And here we see the effect on mortality reduction for someone, male or female, aged 65. So mortality reductions, this is a reduction factor on mortality. So we see from the outset, there's no impact. And of course, we know that it takes over a year for the drug to take effect, for the drug to remove these amyloid plaques. So you'd expect fairly limited mortality effect in the early stages. But over time, that effect increases. So for this particular population, this is the study population. So there is 55% have mild Alzheimer's. Sorry, everyone has mild Alzheimer's, but 55% have the sort of lesser mild Alzheimer's, and 45% have the more severe but mild Alzheimer's. And individuals progress over time into the moderate and into the severe states of Alzheimer's. So over time, you have this progression which results in mortality, and as it slows down, we have a reduction in mortality. But as we get into the latter stages, where most people are now in the moderate to severe states, you end up with this fairly limited, moving towards zero reduction in mortality. Now, what does this look like in terms of mortality reduction or life expectancy? Sorry, so for males, about 3.3%, and from females, about 3.7%. The life expectancy for an individual with mild Alzheimer's is around 6 years. So this is 3.5% on a life expectancy of about 6 years for this 65-year-old. So how do we interpret this? Well, the impact for this particular study is focused on individuals with mild forms of Alzheimer. Now, of course, if we look at the bigger picture, the general population, actually about of the individuals with Alzheimer's, about 60% have severe Alzheimer's. So this is really a maximum improvement that we're looking at. If you sort of take this up into the general population, the effect is going to be smaller. And then if we sort of think about the proportion of undiagnosed Alzheimer's, we again have a lesser effect. So all of this information can be used to come up with an estimate for what this particular intervention might do for mortality. But this is the first. So there are other interventions in the pipeline, and fairly optimistic. Things are looking fairly optimistic now for this particular disease, but we still have a long way to go to before we see anything spectacular. Okay, so that's the end of the presentation. Thank you so much. I haven't been looking at the chat, but I suspect there have been some questions,
There
perhaps.
have been some questions. The
Yeah.
good news. So thanks a lot for that, Ashley. There's a lot of information to take in. So thank you. But let's go through the questions that we've asked. So Stephen says, well, it's been very insightful, and asked if you're able to comment on the extent to which that diet and lifestyle factors have been reflected in the studies, which suggest that the age standardized incidence and prevalence will fall.
Yes. So well, first of all, let's talk about these particular risk factors. So yes, diet and lifestyle are significant risk factors for dementia. In particular, individuals that develop cardiac issues are more susceptible to dementia. Individuals that develop diabetes more susceptible to dementia as well. The actual projections within that particular study, and actually the references there, have underlying them projections for those underlying risk factors. So you actually find that the underlying risk factors, or the trajectory for those risk factors, has been taken into account within that standardized incidence and prevalence fall.
Great, thank you. Okay, so Roberts has asked, so while we recognize that cohort studies are showing a fall, and obviously we're trying to interpret the age standardized increase, so do we think that kind of the diagnosis effect that we saw kind of back at the early kind of 2000s that you spoke about, is that largely filtering through, because these are the people actually probably who now have possibly died of dementia? So is that kind of like less of an issue now? Is it more just a case of being something to be aware of when looking at historical data?
Yeah, so I think I understand the question. So the effect of doctors having been incentivized to diagnose dementia back in 2003, that has now essentially flown through into the data. Absolutely. So I was reading a study actually today that said that sort of data effect shouldn't be as much of an issue now. So we sort of see it's kind of an effect in the early era, but actually we shouldn't see it come through as much. But there is still going to be an increase associated with aging if you look at the non-age standardized effect. But when you look at the age standardized effect, that gets removed.
Right. Thank you. Now, I think this question was in relation when you were talking about the different treatments. So I just wondered if you just elaborate on what you meant by effect and mortality is proportional.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah. So this was meant to be a simplification. So if you were not going to use a Markov model, one might say that actually a 30% reduction in the progress of dementia might result in a sort of a proportional effect on mortality. But actually, we see in the Markov modeling, that would be a very fair, simple assumption of the maximum impact. But actually, when you do the Markov modeling, that effect size is actually much smaller. So I guess the interpretation of that is it would be a fair assumption of an upper limit, but when you do the Markov modeling itself and you keep the mortality rates for each state the same as they should be, you actually see a much smaller effect coming through when you adjust the transition probabilities.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so keep the questions coming. We've got a good 10 minutes left for questions, and I've got a few as well. So if we don't get any more in, you'll be lumbered with my questions. Just wondered, so Stephen wondered if you could comment on the prospects for earlier diagnosis of dementia, and how would this combine with the treatment, and do you have a sense of how much further that might increase life expectancy?
Yeah, so I think basically the diagnosis, the way in which dementia is diagnosed at the moment is fairly poor. So essentially there are cognitive tests that doctors carry out for the individual. And the earlier the phase, the harder it is to actually diagnose. I'm not sure about the pipeline in terms of diagnosis. I can't really answer that question. But the important thing to sort of acknowledge is if, from a what-if perspective, if the diagnosis rate is improved, you will have a larger population from which treatment can then be applied to, and therefore you will have a larger mortality improvement. So there is a kind of a domino effect of improving diagnosis. And again, if people aren't diagnosed, they're not going to be treated. And this is also a product of when a drug is approved. It's really important to be aware that the indication for which it is approved for is really important, because you might see a drug approved for Alzheimer's disease and think this is great news, but actually this particular drug is for mild Alzheimer's disease. The individuals that were put into the trial had only been diagnosed a year ago. So these are fairly mild versions of the disease itself. So diagnosis rates will improve the effect of a treatment on mortality.
Yeah. And I guess kind of going to the second part of the question, where it says that having a sense for how much further that might increase life expectancy, I guess it's not necessarily a case of the question is about the increase in life expectancy. It's I guess the question is how many people see that increase in life expectancy.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's all about getting an understanding for the size of the target population and applying your effect size or your impact on that, and then to try and understand the effect of improved diagnosis. Well, that's just a change in the overall population size that you're applying the effect size to. So the increase should be broadly proportional to the increase in the number of the proportion that's diagnosed.
Yeah. I particularly like this next question. So how do you access the data from these longitudinal studies, and are they widely available?
Yeah, they're all publicly available, and actually longitudinal studies in particular tend to be very publicly available. And the underlying data, that's the hard bit to get. So the data for the individuals that are going through the longitudinal study is protected. So you can't directly access the individualized data without some kind of research reason or public good and so on. So if you're a commercial body like an insurer, you won't be able to access the information. But studies get carried out on top of longitudinal studies. You'll see a longitudinal study, but there will be so many studies that have been done on the back of that study itself, on particular aspects of it, different subpopulation stratifications and so on. So the information is huge. The easiest way to get the information is actually going to whatever database you use. We use Embase as our database, but actually PubMed is actually free to use. And actually there is an easy way to search for these. There's actually an indication that each study gets tagged with that it's a cohort study, and you can essentially find that, do searches on a particular intervention or disease, and find whether those are actually mentioned within the articles and pull the information. So yeah, the literature is the best place initially to find this information.
Great, thank you. So we all go off and do loads of analysis.
Yeah.
Okay, now this is a question. I think it's something that's a lot. I mean, following the pandemic, I think it's a question that gets asked. It's a good question to ask us a lot more now, and that's kind of like, what does it mean to die from dementia, and how it interacts with the results of the Markov model? Because I mean, a number of sufferers. I mean, as we know, people who do look at this kind of thing and cause of death that are registered, people are generally that have a lot of comorbidities. So are a number of kind of sufferers dying with rather than of dementia, so that your results of the Markov model might overstate the benefit?
Yeah, really good question. So there's two sort of aspects to this question. So first of all, if we think about the actuarial world, so looking at cause of death data, there are kind of two levels you can go to. So you can go to the underlying cause, which can be dementia, and actually the incentivization, which began in 2003, also incentivized doctors to actually put dementia as the cause if they felt that that was the actual cause of death, and so that increased the number of deaths. So there's two levels. So there's first level underlying cause, and that is increasing, but it's not the true representation of the mortality. There's died with dementia, which is the next level, which you can also get data on. And again, that's individuals that perhaps had a fall or had some other comorbidity deemed to be the primary cause, but they died with dementia. Now, when you're parameterizing a Markov model, you can't use this information. It's, as you say, it might overstate or potentially understate actually the mortality associated with dementia. What's actually better to use is these cohort studies, for example, that actually give you a better representation of the rate at which people die from dementia and other causes. So yeah, you need to be really careful when parameterizing these models. They're essentially a perfect view of the world, so you can't use general population data because there's so much recording biases within it.
Great, thank you. Okay, we've just got a few more minutes left. There's no more questions on the chat, so I'm going to jump in and ask one of my questions then, which I haven't prepared you for, so apologies for that. I mean, obviously, so we've probably got a lot of longevity actuaries on this call who are kind of like very busy, kind of like constantly on the lookout on what is the next big thing that they need to be looking out for. So what would be the kind of the announcements that would kind of make you start thinking, do you know what, that's something that we need to start taking allowance for? Would you say it is a treatment or is it screening? Because I mean, I suspect like a blood test, if a blood test was identified that could identify dementia in the early stages, then is that a risk of a bigger game changer than say a treatment, or is it a combination?
Yeah, good question. So actually, interestingly, so we've only been talking about treatments that are going through trial right now that have an indication for, by indication, I mean that the target population is individuals with dementia, but actually there's the potential is far wider. So for example, GLP-1 or a treatment for diabetes has actually been shown to have significant impact on the likelihood of getting dementia over time. So because diabetes treatments have been around for a long time, there's some great data out there that shows the effect. So it's not just direct treatments that we need to be looking at. It's the effects of other treatments that are coming through the pipeline that have knock-on effects on Alzheimer's disease, but also all age-related diseases, because they're all interconnected. There's not any one, silver bullet that's going to solve the issue. Actually, it's going to be a combination of treatments for many different indications that's going to actually have the big mover. I know that's not really answered your question fully, but I think what I'm trying to say is actuaries shouldn't be trying to silo themselves, or we shouldn't be trying to silo ourselves into looking at specific treatments as being the indicated for dementia as being the only possible treatments that is going to reduce dementia mortality. Treatments for cardiovascular disease, treatments for other comorbidities that are linked to aging they're all interconnected, and they will all have an effect on these age-related diseases, or they can all have an effect on these age-related diseases.
Great. Well, I think that's actually a very good question to finish on then, just to kind of like just that reminder that not to limit ourselves too much to looking at a single disease. But actually, that's been really helpful. Thank you for sharing your research and for this presentation. And thank you to the audience for your questions. If you'd like to listen to this again, or if you want, or if there's people who weren't able to make the call, then there is a recording of this that will be available on our website. And everyone who's signed up will also, in the next few days, receive an email that will have a link to this recording. So thank you again, and say always keep an eye out on the emails. We try and do a webinar once every couple of months, and so hopefully you'll join us for another webinar in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.